1. Pre-colonial period and indigenous societies. Before European contact, South Africa was home to a variety of indigenous groups with rich cultures and histories. San and Khoikhoi peoples. The San, Bushmen, are among the oldest human populations in the world, having lived in southern Africa for tens of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers. They developed a deep understanding of the natural environment, evidenced by their intricate rock art found throughout the region. The Khoikhoi, Koko, arrived in the area about 2,000 years ago and were pastoralists, herding cattle and sheep. They had a more structured society than the San, with defined social hierarchies and chieftainships. Bantu migration. Beginning around the 3rd century CE, Bantu-speaking peoples began migrating southward into the region from Central and Eastern Africa. They brought with them ironworking technology, agricultural practices, and a settled lifestyle, leading to the establishment of complex societies. The Bantu-speaking communities, including the ancestors of the Zulu, Xhosa, and Sotho, established powerful kingdoms and engaged in trade and warfare with other groups. The formation of the Kingdom of Mapungubwe around 1075 marked the development of the region's first state-level society, which was heavily involved in regional trade. 2. European colonization and Dutch rule, 1652 to 1795. The arrival of Europeans in the 17th century drastically altered the social and political landscape of South Africa. Dutch East India Company settlement. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company, a VOC, established a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope under Jan van Riebeeck to serve as a midpoint for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. This small outpost quickly grew as the Dutch settlers, or Boers, farmers, began to expand their territories. The VOC introduced enslaved labor from Madagascar, Indonesia, and East Africa, creating a multi-ethnic society that laid the groundwork for future racial divisions. Conflicts and expansion. The expansion of Dutch settlers led to conflicts with the Khoikhoi, who were increasingly displaced from their grazing lands. The settlers moved further inland, encroaching on the lands of other indigenous peoples, including the Xhosa. These conflicts marked the beginning of a long history of dispossession and resistance that would characterize much of South Africa's history. 3. British rule and the rise of the Boer republics, 1795 to 1910. The late 18th and 19th centuries were marked by British colonization and the establishment of independent Boer republics. British takeover of the Cape. The British seized control of the Cape Colony from the Dutch in 1795, briefly returned it in 1803, and then reoccupied it permanently in 1806 as part of their global strategy during the Napoleonic Wars. British rule brought significant changes, including the introduction of English law, abolition of slavery in 1834, and new land policies that displaced many African communities. These changes prompted dissatisfaction among the Boers. The Great Trek and Boer Republics. Between 1836 and 1845, in response to British policies, thousands of Boers embarked on the Great Trek to escape British control, moving into the interior and establishing independent republics such as the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. This migration led to a series of conflicts with African kingdoms, most notably the Zulu under King Shaka, resulting in the establishment of Boer settlements and further expansion into African territories. British expansion and the Anglo-Zulu War. The British continued their expansion into the region, leading to the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. The British victory over the Zulu Kingdom marked the end of significant indigenous resistance in the region and paved the way for further British colonization and control over the Boer republics. 4. The Mineral Revolution and the Anglo-Boer Wars, 1867 to 1902. The discovery of minerals transformed South Africa's economy and intensified conflict over control. Discovery of diamonds and gold. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand in 1886 revolutionized South Africa's economy, leading to a rapid influx of foreign capital and an enormous demand for labor. This mineral wealth heightened tensions between the British and the Boers, as both sought control over these lucrative resources. Anglo-Boer Wars. The tensions culminated in the First Anglo-Boer War, 1880 to 1881, which ended with a Boer victory and the restoration of the independence of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. However, the discovery of gold in the Transvaal led to renewed British interest in the region, culminating in the Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. This brutal conflict saw the use of guerrilla warfare by the Boers and the establishment of concentration camps by the British, which caused the deaths of thousands of Boer civilians. The war ended with the Treaty of Vereniging, which placed the Boer republics under British control but granted limited autonomy. 5. Union of South Africa and the Foundations of Apartheid, 1910 to 1948. The early 20th century saw the consolidation of British and Boer interests and the formalization of racial segregation. Formation of the Union of South Africa. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed as a self-governing dominion within the British Empire, uniting the British colonies and Boer republics into a single state. The new constitution entrenched white minority rule, excluding the majority black population from political power. The government began to implement policies of racial segregation, which laid the groundwork for apartheid. Segregation and early apartheid policies. Throughout the early 20th century, the South African government enacted several laws that entrenched racial segregation and economic inequality. These included the 1913 Natives Land Act, which restricted African land ownership to designated reserves, and the 1923 Urban Areas Act, which controlled African movement into urban areas. The 1936 Representation of Natives Act further disenfranchised black South Africans by removing them from the common voter rolls. 6. Apartheid era, 1948 to 1994. The formal system of apartheid, introduced in 1948, institutionalized racial discrimination and sparked decades of resistance. Implementation of apartheid. In 1948, the National Party came to power and implemented a system of apartheid, apartness, a formalized racial segregation policy. Apartheid laws included the Population Registration Act, which classified citizens by race, the Group Areas Act, which segregated residential areas, and the Bantu Education Act, which provided inferior education for black South Africans. These laws created a rigid racial hierarchy and severely restricted the rights of non-white populations. Resistance and repression. Opposition to apartheid grew steadily, with groups like the African National Congress, ANC, founded in 1912, leading protests and civil disobedience campaigns. The Defiance Campaign of the 1950s and the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960, where 69 protesters were killed by police, marked significant moments of resistance. The government responded with increased repression, banning political organizations, arresting leaders like Nelson Mandela, and instituting a police state. Internal struggle and international pressure. By the 1970s and 1980s, resistance intensified with widespread strikes, uprisings, and international condemnation. The 1976 Soweto uprising was a major turning point, as thousands of black students protested against the imposition of Afrikaans in schools, leading to a brutal crackdown and increased global attention. Sanctions and divestment campaigns mounted by the international community placed economic pressure on the apartheid regime. 7. The end of apartheid and the transition to democracy, 1990 to 1994. A combination of internal resistance and international pressure forced the apartheid regime to negotiate. Negotiations and reforms. In 1990, President F.W. de Klerk announced the unbanning of the ANC and other political organizations and the release of Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years. These actions paved the way for negotiations to end apartheid. The Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA, negotiations began in 1991, involving a wide range of political groups to draft a new constitution. First democratic elections. After protracted negotiations, a new interim constitution was adopted in 1993, and in April 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial democratic elections. The ANC won a significant majority, and Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president, marking the official end of apartheid and the beginning of a new era of democracy. 8. Post-apartheid South Africa, 1994-present. Since the end of apartheid, South Africa has faced both progress and challenges as it navigates its democratic transition. Reconciliation and reconstruction. The new government pursued a policy of national reconciliation and established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, to investigate human rights abuses during apartheid. The TRC, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, sought to promote healing by uncovering the truth and offering amnesty to those who confess to political crimes. Economic and social challenges. Despite political progress, South Africa has faced significant challenges, including high levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, much of which are a legacy of apartheid. Issues such as corruption, crime, and inadequate public services have also affected the country's development. However, South Africa remains one of Africa's largest economies and has made strides in areas such as healthcare, education, and housing. Continued struggles and future outlook. Today, South Africa continues to grapple with its complex history and strive for a more equitable society. The legacy of apartheid remains visible in economic disparities and social tensions, but the nation's resilience and commitment to democracy provide a foundation for future progress.